Hello, in this video we're going to talk about fills. So we've already learned how to draw lines. Now let's start drawing fills. So there's too many um, tools on this, so we're going to go to the help menu and choose step-by-step training, and we're going to select the fills part 1 video. And that has changed your desktop to less toolbars. You notice that there's some new toolbars shown here. You see these items here, you see these items here, and then there's additional items under here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just do a basic fill using a circle. We're going to draw a circle on the screen, and if you don't know how to do lines and curves, watch the line and curve videos first because it's very important for you to understand that. Everything in EmbroideryWare is based off of these lines and curves. So the question I have for you right now is we have drawn a circle. So how would this work with a fill? Well, the graphics define the border of the fill. So when we choose this, we can cause it to fill by choosing this for fill top stitches, and it will fill with top stitches. These are what we call quick buttons, and this also is a quick menu. It allows us to set stitch types, which is a new concept I haven't talked about yet, and a few settings to go along with it. It just makes it quicker. The way we traditionally set up the program initially to set up all these stitch types, before we added a lot of buttons, a lot of people comment that there are so many buttons that it looks like the program is very complicated, where the buttons really aren't adding complication, they're just adding shortcuts to doing things that you would do in the properties browser. Now we haven't talked about the properties browser yet, but basically what the properties browser is when we have a graphic selected, it will show the properties for that particular graphic. Now for this particular line, we have color. You can ignore the system color, that just shows you the RGB values of the color. But if you wanted to change the color, you could choose the color down a drop down where you would see a bunch of named colors for, in this case, brother colors. These colors are also down here in the color bar. Sometimes it's easier just to change them by pressing the button when you have a graphic selected. So now this one is sort of a, I guess, pink salmon color. So we're going to change it to a lighter blue so you can see how the fill is going to fill. So traditionally we would just, when we first came out with EmbroideryWare, you just choose the fill from this drop-down menu, which is different stitch types. So we're going to choose fill. When we choose fill, it fills it with a bunch of parallel rows of stitches. That's what all that a fill is a bunch of parallel rows of stitches. If we zoom in here, you can see that there's a bunch of parallel rows of stitches. We have to zoom in quite a ways for you to see it. And the reason fills look the way they do is there is a pattern of needle penetrations that are created in these rows of stitches to give it texture. In this case, the default fill type kind of gives it sort of a twill fabric look. Unlike running stitches, the stitches aren't every so many millimeters, like 15 here. Even though there's a 15 here, it doesn't apply when the fill has a needle penetrations pattern, which basically is this fill file name, which shows you how the pattern of fills go. And if there was no pattern here at all, you erase the pattern, then basically the pattern would be determined by the stitch length here. So if I change this to something very large like 200, you'll see that there's only a few stitches every 200 millimeters in those parallel lines. So let's make the parallel lines spread apart so you can see more what we're talking about here. And that's controlled in the properties browser. Everything gets categorized around certain titles. Since we chose a fill, this title becomes available, and there's parameters in here to adjust the fill. One of them is the spacing of the parallel lines. So if we change this to a larger number, you'll see the parallel lines of the fill. And so what happens with the fill is basically it goes back and forth in the boundaries of your graphic, your curve. So when I was saying that lines and curves are the most important thing that you need to learn about EmbroideryWare, is that the lines and curves that we drew, and in this case the circle, define the boundaries of the fill. And so if we wanted to have running stitches to go around the edge of the fill as a second graphic, we could do that simply by copying the fill, and then we could just change the graphic back into a running stitch. Of course, it's set to 200, which is quite a bit. And now we have a running stitch going around the fill. So I know I keep on harping on this or mentioning this, but learning how to manipulate lines and curves is the most important thing that you need to learn in EmbroideryWare, because every single embroidery type is based off of these lines and curves. These are the two things that you need to learn how to draw well in order for you to understand how to do the embroidery you want. Basically, the lines and curves can be turned into any embroidery object because they're all based off of the lines and curves. So I just created a second embroidery object that was a different type by just simply changing the type. If I change the type back to fill, now we have two fills again. And the settings that we had in the fill, we erased the fill file. Well, actually, in this case, it put it back. But if we erase this fill file type, now there's no longer a pattern to put the needle penetrations down, and then it's still driven by this parameter here. In most cases, you're not going to have to override the pattern that is created by EmbroideryWare. But this is probably useful if you're doing something like a free lace project where you don't want the long spacing that is created by the patterns. Because in the case of the patterns, they generally, if I set this back to 15, you'll see that there's quite a few stitches, just normally like a running stitch. So this would be just like a running stitch going back and forth. But when I change this pattern to a fill pattern, and all I did is I selected the drop down. Let me do that again so that you can see what I'm talking about. If you click the fill file name here, click these dots, up will come the different patterns we have, and there's graphical representations of what they look like. So I'm going to just change this back to the default, which is alphabetical, so default fill pattern, to show you that the stitches are quite spaced far apart. So like if you're doing a free lace pattern, you don't really want to do this like this, because it's going to be too far apart. These are just going to be floppy threads. You probably want to have more needle penetrations for your free lace background. All right, so we have selected the different fill types. So let's get the spacing down to something smaller so that we can see kind of what the patterns do. So once you have it at the default, which is 2, we have this function called 3D, which will show you what it looks like. So when we click 3D, you can see that it kind of looks like a twill. And you're like, how did that happen? They're all a bunch of parallel stitches, and why are they sort of on a diagonal? Well, each needle penetration pulls the thread through the fabric, which causes a shadow. So even though these threads are quite spaced far apart for each row, if I go back to 20, you can see this. Even though these are spaced quite a ways away, the net effect visually that you see is a pattern. And so this can create some really neat effects. You can get um, some depth and texture to your embroidery design. So choosing your fill patterns appropriately can give you some really neat effects. So let me go and change this back to 2 so we can talk about some other types of fill patterns, and so you can kind of understand what they do. So we turn the 3D on, you see the 12 pattern. We also have this ability in um, to see the 3D in the actual fill file name selection. So there's different ways to select this file. You can select it doing that click like that, and it's a file on the computer. Um, or you can click this here, which is basically, it says choose fill pattern when the pop-up comes up, and you get the same file. Or you can choose it here under the quick menu for choose file pattern. Okay. If we click 3D mode here, and we click this, it'll show us what it's going to look like when it goes into 3D mode. So there we see the twill pattern. Now let's choose something that's funner, like maybe some diamonds. Now there'll be diamonds on the screen. And this is all just determined on how the needle penetrations go through the fabric. We have some options here, sort of kind of like a random fill, that can kind of give you some interesting texture on some things. You can have a very ordered fill that is just a bunch of rows of patterns. You can have zigzags. So there's many different patterns to choose from, and there can be more patterns that you can add to the program if they're available in the store or from other users, etc. So there's a lot you can do with this. Now, in the pattern screen, there are some adjustments that you can make to the pattern that create different effects. So let's go and choose the diamonds again. Now these diamonds aren't square, so if you want square diamonds, you can have the needle penetrations increment through the pattern file every other increment by just increasing how it steps through the file. So if we change this to 2, let's say, now we have square diamonds. If we change this to larger number, then it gets a diamond shape like that. And you can play around with this, and you can have many different textures just with one selection of one fill pattern. At some point, I think it ends up uh, overwriting itself. So you can go, you have to test these out and see how they work before you commit to them. Okay, so that is a fill pattern. Let's change this back to the default. So I'm just going to choose this again, which will push it to the default. Or actually, it didn't. Let me try this again. I'm going to put this into the default. Okay. Oh, it doesn't look like the. See, we have a diagonal pattern here because we have this fill pattern X set so high, so that even the default, everyone gets changed. Based on that fill increment. So you can see I can change the standard fill pattern, default fill pattern into different things too. There will be different effects depending on the pattern that's selected, as you can see. Oh, you don't want 0. Okay. Um, all right, so there's other parameters here that you're probably curious about. What is the angle? Well, the angle is the parallel lines, what angle the parallel lines are. So if I set this to 0, you'll see that these lines that sort of look like the twill have switched. Let's say I set it to 180. I'm going to set it to 179 and click this. Um, Actually, they don't really move that much, do they? In some other patterns, they would. Okay, so you can get to this menu in the three different ways with this selection, or choosing this button here. The angle of the fill can also be changed in this screen, and you can do various settings like that increment that we're talking about. You can change that here too. So some things are repeated in different menus for your convenience, and also for those who've used the other ways in the past. So most of the features still are in the program that they were from day one. Okay, so we have this pattern here. We have this fill here, and this is not really that interesting, I suppose, but so what are the other graphics that can drive this? Now, one of the questions that's asked often is, how do I add a hole? So what a hole is just another graphic. So if I draw another graphic here, I can use this other graphic as a hole for the fill. Now the fill is defined by this graphic right here, which would be called the parent graphic. And then we can embed other graphics into the parent to be as children. So if I want this to be a child of this and I want it to be a whole, I can add it to the other graphic as a whole. And this applies to any other embroidery types that EmbroideryWare supports. So holes can be added to satin lines, which we haven't discussed yet, motif fills, things like that. So if it makes sense for something to have a hole, if you add a hole with this method for the fill, it'll be the same for everything else. We also have things called unions and intersections. So let's start with the hole. So obviously the hole is not going to cut anything out here. So we're going to move the hole over to the graphic. Now I'm not going to put it in the center yet because I want to show you how it cuts. So to add a hole, in other words, to add this child to this parent as a whole, we select the Add Hole tool, and the instructions would say, click on the curve to add to the hole to. Now see how it says curve, because everything's driven by lines and curves. That drives everything. So we're going to select this curve, and then it's going to ask, click on the curve to add. So now we've clicked on that curve to add, and it's added a hole. So this is now one graphic because, well, it's a graphic with a child in it called another graphic, which we defined as a hole. So basically we've embedded this other graphic in the other graphic. But again, the graphics are still driving the embroidery. Okay, so we have this hole in here and we want to modify it. Well, just like any other graphics, you can modify the points. So we can say edit points, and we can move the graphics of the hole to any way we want. Now let's say we wanted this hole completely inside here and we wanted to move the whole graphic, the child graphic that represents the hole. You have a feature down here. It's called Move Selected Child. So if we choose that, we can click on the child to move, and we're done selecting the child. You notice that this child has now turned red, and it says right click when finished selecting. So we right click. Now at this point, it's just like before with the move command. We click a point we want to start from, and then we move it. And then we click again, and now the hole is completely inside the graphic. So I'm going to attempt to modify this a little bit and make it sort of like a heart shape. Or attempt to. Okay. My drawing skills aren't going to be the thing that you need to follow in this video. All right, so we have roughly a heart shape in the fill. Now there's other types of things that you can do. Let's say we wanted to add another graphic, and it doesn't have to be a circle graphic. Remember, the graphics drive the embroidery. So if you think about it, if I'm adding this graphic to this fill, what exactly am I doing? I'm going to make it so that it's completely goes around it, so then the interior of this graphic ends up being what is going to be added to the fill. Okay, so how do we add this graphic to the fill? Well, to add the graphic to the fill, we can add what's called a union. So we click union, click these two, you'll see that now I've changed the fill to union those objects. So now the fill composed of two children. The graphic that I just added, and then the fill. Now the fill, there's an order of how these are added. So the union happens first, and then the fill happens last. Okay. So now I don't want that, and I don't want the fill, let's say. So we can remove the graphics. So there's a thing called here, remove graphic from the object. So it says click on the parent curve to remove the child from. So we click on that, and then we can click on the heart to remove the heart. I didn't do that right. Sorry. Let me do this again. You got to click on the curves graphics actually, which this is kind of difficult. I think this is it. Okay. Click on the curves graphic, and I'm going to click on the curve to remove. I'm going to remove this one first because this one kind of is hiding a lot of stuff. And then I want to click on the parent curve to remove the child from. Click on this parent curve again, and I'm going to click on this heart. And now I've removed those two graphics. Now you notice the graphics go back to just running stitches when they're removed, and you can use them for some other things. The last thing I want to describe in graphics driving fills is an intersection. So let's say I have two circles, and I want this intersection between the two to be defining the fill. I can add a second curve as a child as an intersection by choosing the intersection tool, and now I have those two.